Thank you very much for this kind introduction. And also thank you to the organizers of this webinar for the invitation to speak to you today. In my talk, I want to start with some thoughts and observations on the FAIR principles. And from there on, I would like to move into the more recently formulated trust principles and repository certification. And in my talk, I hope to convince you of the fact that these two are very complementary and both are very much needed to turn data sharing and reuse of data into a reality. But first, a few words on the organization I work for, which is called DANS. DANS is a data service provider in the Netherlands and one of the national players in our research data landscape. We offer a long-term repository services and are also a national center of expertise in the area of research data management, long-term preservation, and data curation. So let us first start with the FAIR principles. More or less by accident, I happened to be at their birth in Leiden in 2014. At that time, there was a workshop for the life sciences in Leiden. And at that workshop, a group of people came up with a minimal set of community agreed kind of guiding principles for, you could say, for data sharing. It took another 2 years until 2016 for these guiding principles to be firmly consolidated, you could say, and also well described in an article in Nature Scientific Data that you see here on the screen. And again, sometime later, these 4 quite generic principles were further refined and they were explained with a number of metrics that could possibly facilitate their implementation. So for example, you see them here on the screen. The general principle findable was further detailed into saying that if a data set is findable, it means that it needs to have a persistent identifier attached to the data set. It should have rich metadata. It should be indexed in data repositories, etc., etc. So through the years, the FAIR principles were further refined. But on the other hand, I think the FAIR principles also created some confusion here and there and still do. First of all, I think it's very important to be aware that fair or not fair is not a binary thing. It is not a black and white thing. I see FAIR really as a continuum that we need to strive for, and a data set should therefore be as fair as possible. Also important to understand that fair and open are not the same. Data can be 100% open for everybody, but still not fair at all if they are not well described, if they do not have metadata, etc., etc. And also the other way around. Fair data can be perfectly fair, but can perhaps not be completely open because they contain sensitive information. So the two things are not the same. Fair, I think, is very much at that time a new buzzword because it is really all about high quality research data management. And we were thinking about that also before 2014. But still, the term FAIR gave a big push to the discourse around research data management and stewardship. So now we are 6 years after the publication of the principles. And what is the success of FAIR? Well, here you see some figures, a graph from a recent survey that was done, commissioned by the European Commission in Europe, amongst 15,000 researchers across Europe and across domains. And when they were asked about FAIR, more than a third of those researchers still had not heard about the term. And only 1 out of 5 said that they put the FAIR principles really in their day-to-day practice when dealing with data. So it looks like we still have quite a world to win here. You also see this in this slide when the researchers were asked about their daily data practices. And you can see on the screen that very basic FAIR elements like adding a license to your data set or acquiring a persistent identifier for your data set is still not common use. As you can see, only 17% of the researchers adds a license and only 19% adds a persistent identifier to their data set. So you could argue, on the other hand, that researchers probably do not need to know the term FAIR itself. They just need to align with the practices. But also when you look at those practices, we're not there yet. There is also, in that research, what also became clear, and I think that also relates to the previous speaker, that there are some issues around the motivation for making your data fair and for data sharing. What we learned in this research from the researchers is that they are in need of clear policies around fair and data sharing. They are in need of support to comply with all those principles. And big barriers for them are the fact that doing good research data management takes a lot of time and effort. And that time and effort up till now is not really recognized. You don't get any academic credits for that, and that is a big barrier. And they also have concerns about data protection and legal restrictions. So all in all, I think you can say that FAIR is well known as a concept among policymakers and funders and data service providers, but maybe still a lot less under researchers. At least that is what the results in Europe say. So even if a researcher claims that a data set is fair, how can we know? Who says so? We are currently also in a phase where we are thinking about FAIR metrics and FAIR assessment. And at the moment, there are many sets of metrics around and also different tools. And we need to get to some agreement and convergence in this area. Everybody can say that data set is fair, but how do we know? Up till now, a formal certification is not really on the horizon. We are currently really in a phase where we try to go from a fruit basket full of metrics and tools to a stage where we at least can compare apples to apples. So current issues around FAIR metrics and assessment are things like the different tools that make different implementation choices. And those different tools also have different weighing scores. They weigh the elements of FAIR in a different way. So all of these results coming out of those tools are not very comparable. And we also have the issue that the principles very often have different meanings in different domains. So this is an area where we still have a lot of work to do. Having sketched that current situation, that current state of play and the challenges that we still have, I still want to show you one of these tools. This tool is the result of a European project called FAIR's FAIR. There it was built, and the tool is called Fuji. And Fuji is a web service to programmatically assess the fairness of research data sets at a data set level. And it's based on the FAIR data maturity model that was developed in the Research Data Alliance, so a kind of international standard. It, like I said, is one of multiple tools that is still a moving target, but still. Fuji has a manual instance for humans, but also an automated one that can be implemented by repositories in their workflow. And I want to show you that tool on the basis of a data set that is in our repository at DANS, and that comes from a Japanese researcher and is a data set that deals with forests. And you can see here the data set in our repository. And as you can see, the data set has a DOI, digital object identifier, a persistent identifier. And if you ingest that identifier into the tool, into Fuji, As you can see here, Fuji runs a test, and this data set, Fuji tells us, has a 41% fairness. And that fairness is explained for the different principles, as you can see on the screen, the F, the A, the I, and the R. And for each of that principles, the tool gives you a fair level. So this data set has a moderate fairness with respect to the findability. And for all the other elements, the data set is still in its initial phase. And then this tool also provides a lot of verbose information about the elements that are lacking. So for example, under interoperability, and the metric that the metadata should use semantic resources, this data set is missing a couple of elements. And by pointing this out, it's also a good instrument to help to increase the fairness of a data set. Another tool that we developed in this FAIR's FAIR project is FAIR-Aware, which is really an awareness tool that can be used by researchers to, at the start of their research, when they start the gathering of their data, to make them aware of all the elements they need to think of. And this is done, as you can see here on the screen, with a series of questions for each of the letters. If a researcher answers a question with no, so for example, here you see a question, and it's a little bit small on the screen. It's a question around metadata and semantics, then there is an explanation of what that means and why it is important, and how a researcher can go about to take care of that. It talks about controlled vocabularies, and it also points the researcher to more information. So really an awareness raising tool for researchers to get them underway with research data management. Now, I've given you an overview of the FAIR developments, but the question, of course, is this enough to make and also to keep data reusable? Do we have enough with those FAIR principles? And of course, I will argue that we have not, because the FAIR principles really focus on data and metadata. And they provide, if you will, a kind of snapshot of a digital object quite in isolation of its context, because it looks only at the data. I very much like the quote that you see here from a colleague of mine that you see here on the screen, because research data will not become nor stay fair by magic. We need more. We need a whole environment around it, and that environment exists of skilled people, transparent processes, interoperable technologies, and collaboration. We need all of that to build, operate, and maintain research data infrastructures in which the data, the FAIR data, live. The metrics, the FAIR metrics, also clearly show dependencies with the data infrastructure in which the data are managed, are living, and are preserved. To give you some examples of such dependencies, for example, the persistence and resolvability of identifiers is not taken care of within the data set. You need infrastructure for that. You also need infrastructure to make for the indexing in searchable resources. You also need infrastructure for the provision and support of standards. But you also need humans to make sure that the retention policies for the data are kept, are being taken care of. And you need people to take care of the data curation. So all of those dependencies lead to the development of this concept of a FAIR data ecosystem, in which you not only need the data, you need data repositories, you need standards, you need data services. So we need an infrastructure in the widest sense of the word. It is not only a researcher that does good research data management. We need a lot more than that. of course, that infrastructure that is needed to keep the data fair needs to be trusted by the researchers if we want them to share the data for reuse. This is an old quote you see on the screen, but I think it's very valid until this day. And it says that perhaps the biggest challenge in sharing data is trust. How do you create a system, an infrastructure that is robust enough for scientists to trust that if they share their data won't be lost, garbled, stolen, or misused? I think that is really at the heart of what we try to achieve with data infrastructure. Now, complementary to the FAIR principles for data, we now have the trust principles that are focused on repositories to guide us. These trust principles were developed under the umbrella, again, of the Research Data Alliance. Like I said, they focus on data repositories. They are domain agnostic. And like the FAIR principles, they provide high-level guidelines to facilitate the discussion between the different stakeholders and also to guide the repositories themselves. And you see these principles here on the screen, standing for the letters of trust. The first one is about, provides guidelines around transparency, organizational transparency and data transparency. And transparency is of course vital to trustworthiness. The guidelines deal with responsibility, that the repository is responsible for the authenticity and integrity of the data. It talks about the importance of the users and the fact that repositories should follow the norms and the expectations of the community they serve. It focuses on sustainability of the organization itself and the services and the data. And of course, technology is an important element for the repositories to think about. So these trust principles are high level, like I said, like the FAIR principles. And of course, if the repository wants to implement them, you need to further operationalize them to become implementable. Now here we have a little piece of backwards engineering because we already have different certification standards for data repositories for quite some years. There is an ISO standard 16363, but that is quite cumbersome and there are not a lot of certifications around yet. Another example is the community-driven repository certification standard called Core Trust Seal, again developed under the umbrella of the Research Data Alliance. And that provides a core standard certification that repositories can acquire based on 16 requirements that you see here on the screen around their organizational infrastructure, around digital object management and technology. And a repository can do a self-assessment against these 16 requirements that is then reviewed by peers in a 3-year cycle, and it's very transparent. Everything is openly available. This standard is discipline agnostic and has a wide global uptake. And you can see that here on the map. You can see that around the globe, we now have 135 Core Trust Seal certified repositories. So that is quite a number, and the number is rising pretty fast. So why are repositories interested in doing this? What are the benefits that they perceive? First of all, there are external benefits. It heightens the confidence of stakeholders in a repository if it's certified. And it also increases, of course, the visibility of a repository. But interestingly enough, repositories themselves feel that the internal benefits are even bigger. Because when they go through a process like this, it very much improves their professionalism and it gives them the opportunity to be completely transparent about what they do, how they do it, and why they do it. So I'm coming to the end of my presentation, and this is really the takeaway message that I would like to leave you with. We need to share our data. They are a very important element if we want to turn open science into a reality. Now, the FAIR principles help us to define high quality and transparent research data management practices, like I told you, but I think it's not enough. We also need things like the trust principles and core trust seal certification, because they help us to create trust in the research data infrastructure. And again, that research data infrastructure is needed if we want to safeguard our data, not only now, but also into the future. So if we want to keep the data fair, we need that whole environment. Finally, 2 slides that provide you links to the 2 European projects where a lot of this work is being done, and where there is also a wealth of resource. First of all, FAIR's FAIR. And the other one that is running at the moment is called FAIR Impact. So I'm not going to talk about that. These are just pointers if you are interested in knowing more about all of this. So thank you very much for your attention, and I'm happy to take any questions.